So today I am joined by a fantastic group of speakers from a variety of backgrounds and different disciplines, and they are each going to share their very unique perspectives on the very intriguing topics of today's event. And to kick off, my fabulous co-host Henry Shelvin from the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence will be giving a short introduction to his world of consciousness and cognition. And then this will be followed by 3 5-minute presentations from our fantastic guests, Anna Dimitri, Ivy Farman, and MARCELLO IENCA. And then we will delve into the 4 discussion points, which will act as an anchor for today's discussion. So if you have any questions, please feel free to pop them into our chat function, and we will visit these in the last 25 minutes of the event. So just to remind everyone to keep yourself on mute, that would be absolutely fantastic. And then also note that the event will be recorded. So if you're worried about being seen on the screen, can you just turn your camera off and then you'll become invisible. So just to give you a bit of an introduction about the premise behind today's event, Beyond Biology examines the ethical and the social considerations underlying our technological future. So as we edge ourselves into this world of social robots, wearable technology that can assess our physiological and emotional state, and nanobots the size of microchips that can act autonomously and fix tissues and cells, we're here to respond to this growing need to cast a critical eye on the transformation of the body and the self within these future scenarios. And the analysis we bring you today, it's not an attempt to paint a fearful picture of our biological future with these devices, and it's not a direct celebration of these technological achievements, but really it's a chance to step back and question if these core technological goals of building artificial brains, telepathic neurological chips, and digital avatars, if these are to be achieved, what do we need to consider as humans to consider our immense biological and technological transformation?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gabriella, for putting on this awesome event. And it's very much my privilege to be co-hosting here today. Just a little bit of background about me. I'm a senior researcher at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence at the University of Cambridge. We were founded in 2016 with a grant from the Leverhulme Trust to explore all the societal and scientific impacts of artificial intelligence. And Stephen Hawking opened our inaugural ceremony by saying that creating AI could be the biggest event in the history of our civilization, and it could be the best or it could be the worst. And part of our goal is to try and do our little bit to sort of shepherd AI towards the right direction and try and become aware of some of the potholes and surprises that might be waiting along the way. So my own research is mostly focused on philosophy of cognitive science, philosophy of mind, and the ethical dimensions of where these fields of interest meet AI. So I do a lot of work on AI consciousness. I'm also very interested in how we relate to robots and how we mentalize AI. And I work on topics like AI consciousness, artificial creativity, and more broadly, I'm also very interested in non-human minds considered as a whole. You know, we tend to talk about AI and humans, but we also have a lot of experience with dealing with some kinds of non-human minds in the form of animals. And one of the core goals of my program at the CFI, the program I'm affiliated with, the Kinds of Intelligence program, is to see whether we can gain some insight into how humans will interact with AI, or how AI will present different forms of intelligence via the experiences we already have working with animals. So that's a little bit about my interests, but I'm sure more of the interests of myself and the other panelists will emerge throughout the course of the evening.
Hello. Hello. Can you hear me now? Good. Yes. I'm very pleased to be here, and thank you for the great introduction. And I've got a lot of sort of combined interest there. So I'm going to share my screen if that works. It does work, I think. There we go. Can you see that?
Yeah, coming through brilliantly for me.
It always puts the bar, there's a bit of an AI problem, it always puts the bar over the bit that you want to press. Anyway, so there's a bit of my background there. I won't go through it all, but I have a lot of, I'm an artist, I'm a visual artist, and I work very much embedded in science settings. I work a lot with synthetic biology, and I work with AI, and I work a lot with robotics as well. And kind of my background as an artist in residence in the Centre for Computational Neuroscience and Robotics at Sussex University.
They participated in a study that ran over 16 days. In the beginning, they filled in well-being and other questionnaires, and then they give a diary for the following.
Someone
Also did mind-wandering reports.
Yeah, there we go. I think that seems fine. So an early work that I did was this piece, which is The Emergence of Consciousness, where I tried to reduce my sensory perception down to that of a robot's in order to enable people to kind of understand what consciousness might be for a robot. So very inspired by ideas around Varella's notions of the embodied mind, and also Daniel Dennett's sort of notions around the myth of consciousness, the idea that consciousness is a myth that has kind of arisen and is to do with our sort of multiple inputs and multiple sensory sort of ability, the connections and sensory inputs. And this is the performance, and I covered my whole body with lidocaine, so I couldn't feel my skin. I had earplugs in, and I couldn't move my arm, and then I was trying to find the center of room competing with my robot that I built, which had an evolved control system. So it was kind of a promenade performance where I was staggering kind of around the room. And for those in this sort of community, you might recognize my lovely assistant there is a very, very young Luke Robert Mason, who runs Virtual Futures podcast. And I've lived in a robot house surrounded by robots for 2 weeks. Hertfordshire University has its own robot house. So I've experienced what it's like to do that. It's on a suburban housing estate and populated by lots and lots of kind of different types of robots, and it's a smart home, and they studied me for 2 weeks, and I studied them as an artist. And made artworks. This is my robot with Alex May, called Harry Humanoid Art Research Robot 1, which can do things like express boredom, and it forces you to entertain it. We've also done events with older people and lots of different audiences to kind of get their impressions of robotics and what sort of technologies they would like, and whether they'd be interested in things like robots as carers. This is a piece also with Alex May called Antisocial Swarm Robots. The robots all perform the same algorithm, and kind of they hate each other, they hate the walls of the pen, and they hate the audience. But people will kind of create different personalities for them, and they'll say this one's my favorite, or I hate this one, or this one's in a bad mood. And it's about that way that, you know, if we can't understand this simple algorithm, how are we going to hope to understand other things that are going on? So it's talking about that. Done artworks with exploring epilepsy and deep brain stimulation with light, and that it will engage audiences. This is a collaboration with the University of Hertfordshire and Professor Freek Hobik at the University of Utrecht. This is our Archaea bot, which probably sort of links most closely with what's going on in this event. It's an underwater robot that's based on the oldest, most ancient form of life on the planet, an archaea called Sophalobus acidor caldarius. It's based on cutting edge cryomicroscopy research, where they're trying to actually rebuild the motors that go on it, because it has these kind of cogwheel-like motors, to use them as kind of nanobots to go into the body and drill into bad cells instead of operating tails. And it's kind of the ideal life form for you could say a post-climate change world, because it's incredibly heat tolerant and incredibly acid tolerant, the Sophalobus acidor caldarius. But also it's got a neural net in there. It can understand understand, in scare quotes, its environment, it knows the speed of its motors, very simple things. And yes, it's kind of over-engineered, but it's a conceptual choice as an artist. And we're looking at kind of other ways that we could interact with it and communicate with it. So there's still ongoing work happening there. And finally, the piece that we launched just before the pandemic lockdowns in last year, as in Paris in March, this piece, which is called Cyberspecies Proximity Robot, and it's based on notions of delivery robots and delivery robots of the future and how they might communicate. It's not a design solution, it's a kind of provocation. It's a small, grey, insignificant robot that looks like a worker. It can't speak and it can respond to your body language. And we can go into more of that when we discuss further. So thank you.
Thank you. It's good to be on the stage with everybody here. I have no PowerPoints and no images. I'll just try and say something about what I've done and what I'm doing. I am an anthropologist. I'm also an artist and an organizer. These days, I'm mostly organizing against my other side, which is the artist, organizing against major art institutions that are using proceeds from violence and other terrible sources in order to display some great art, and present themselves as sort of the apotheosis of humanity and of human achievement and so on. So that's a lot of what my time is dedicated to these days, which has perhaps something to do with what we're going to talk about here, because it is a question of ethics and of being embedded in the context in which you're working, and thinking about the implications of it all and not just of some pending future. My work in, I suppose I was invited here because of other work, which has to do with my research now dating back to 2008 or 9, with transhumanists and what I called immortalists, people who were seeking immortality through technological means. At the time, they've become quite well known over the last decade and a half. The names are household names at this point, but at the time it was still not all that common. People had heard of the term cryonics or something like that, usually mislabeling it as cryogenics and so on. But now everybody knows Kurzweil and everybody's heard of transhumanism, because all those people have made it into the mainstream via Silicon Valley. And so, there's a social context there that we need to consider when we talk about these technologies and how they're being developed, by whom. Right? So my own research was really more focused on, I was thinking about how technologies are being used to circumvent death. My interest was in death, and in the end in not dying. And circumventing death, in a sense, is not the same as fostering life. I think that's important to point out. In fact, in a way, it's gone the other way, right? Which is why we're here, which is all the ways in which non-life is proliferating and becoming intelligent, and according to some, maybe more than just becoming sort of functionally, cognitively intelligent, but perhaps gaining other emergent attributes, which we'll not call by name here right now. But I wanted to think of those issues in relation to something else also. And that is the fact that a lot of the way in which I met the transhumanists and the number of things that I heard from them and the number of concerns that they raised seemed to resonate with a lot of existential issues that I thought of as kind of secular tensions. My interest was in secularism and that's where I was coming at it from. So I wasn't coming at it from a philosophy of science or history of science or even anthropology of science perspective. I had to do all of those things to get to where I got. But my interest was kind of thinking about how immortality, which was a notion that was anathema to scientific thinking for centuries, that had been sort of sequestered and put aside because of its association with things like soul and the afterlife and so on, right? How that notion was being taken up again within science and gaining scientific acceptability. Not easily. There's still quite contentious. But so the question was, how are these secular tensions shaping what the Immortalist project was trying to do, how it was shaping the desires and the subjectivities of the Immortalists, right? And some of the questions I was asking was also, because of course, when you're talking about immortality, digital immortality or technologically mediated immortality, you're talking about reproducing something. In this case, people were trying to reproduce themselves without the traditional form of reproduction. So it was about extending their lives, but on other platforms, or extending their being, or extending their personhood, really, on other platforms, on other substrates that were non-biological, and according to them, therefore, more dependable in some way, without the flaws and the limits of biology. So the question for me was, what was it that was being continued or reproduced, and whose continuity mattered, and whose life was being extended, and at what kind of context? So those are some of the kind of questions that I was dealing with, but also the question of the what. The first one I mentioned is somewhat important, not just because there's a kind of because there's an ontological side to it, but also because there's a social side, because the person in question is a bundle of biological things, perhaps, and so on, but they're also a bundle of social things. There's legal, discursive, and political environments in which they become persons and in which their personhood is recognized. So those were the systems that were enabling the continuity of personhood in that context. And I was sort of looking at a lot of the legal and political ways in which the technological project of immortality was taking shape. So a lot of what I thought about was personhood, and maybe we can think a little bit about that as well as a more specific cut into the question of the human or humanity that Gabriela raised earlier. I think I will just leave it at that and let the conversation do the rest of the work for now.
Sure. So I have a mixed background in philosophy and cognitive science, and then I did a PhD in biomedical ethics. And since then, I've been working primarily as what they call an embedded ethicist. So an ethicist that works with within engineering or biomedical departments and tries to incorporate ethical considerations into technology. I do that primarily in relation to newer technologies, such as brain-computer interfaces and whatever can establish some degree of connection between the human brain and the digital world. And I'm based in Zurich, Switzerland at the Federal Institute of Technology. And most of my research revolves around the ethical implications of monitoring or intervening into the brain. So monitoring and altering the brain. And I'm also interested in this topic from a very interdisciplinary perspective. I'm definitely interested in philosophical questions regarding the nature of consciousness and moral responsibility, and how they changed depending on how we intervene into the brain. But I'm also interested in human rights implications of gaining some degree of direct access to the brain.
But Anna, just to start with, I wanted to ask about the art project you're engaged in to emulate what it would be like to be a robot. And it's just interesting to me that you decided to the perceptual limitation, this sort of removal of sensation was a defining part of that. And it's interesting to me for a couple of reasons, I guess. Firstly, because I mean, it's just obviously true, right? That one of the areas in which AI has lagged compared to humans has been in areas like perception. I mean, we've seen some progress over the last decade in things like image recognition, but whereas areas like reflective cognition, inference, logic, reasoning, and so on, playing chess, playing Go, these are areas that AI has excelled. In terms of the more kind of fluid everyday perception, that's an area where the technology is lagged behind. So I was just curious to what extent you were inspired to take this sensory deprivation route, in part because of technical limitations, and also partly perhaps is it associated with this idea that AI somehow has a less rich emotional life, where that has a connection with perception? We think of sort of Commander Data from Star Trek as one of the archetypal AIs, characterized by his emotionless emotionless demeanor. So I just wondered, to what extent was it informed by a sort of sense that robots or AIs have diminished perceptual capabilities still compared to us, and how much of it was this idea that of the coldness or the emotionless of AI?
I think I wasn't thinking about emotionlessness as such, because I think emotion didn't even come into it with the robot. I was very inspired by the book The Embodied Mind by Francisco Varela, Evan Thompson, and Eleanor Roche, and that part in it where where they talk about how a Buddhist monk is like a robot, because like if they're sweeping the ground and if they're doing it mindfully, because the whole book, it's this very famous book for those who haven't come across it, in robotic circles, but it's actually, when you get into it, it's a very strange book, because like about 20% of it is meditation stuff, because Varela was a scientific advisor to the Dalai Lama, but it's hugely influential into kind of in cognitive science and that philosophy of AI kind of world. And so the idea that the monk sweeping the floor is just focused on this process of sweeping. And Varela said that this was very much like a robot that just had access to one sensory input. And my robot, quite a nice robot. This is back in 2010. That's yeah. So it's quite an early-ish work in this area for me anyway. And the robot has a control system that's been evolved to find the center of a room using sonar. So it's bouncing it off the walls and spiraling in, which a human would of course never do. And it was a promenade performance, so there was an audience there. I had a kind of walking stick as a replacement for sonar. I collaborated with Inman Harvey on the development of the piece, who is quite famous in sort of neural networks and AI, A-life stuff. And he said that that was the nearest thing I could get to a kind of sonar for a human. And so I sort of I had no idea of my sensory input, and I was holding this cane and I was trying to find the center of the room, kind of lunging around, and poor Luke Robert Mason was trying to make sure that I didn't kill anyone or step on my robot. That was his main task. And at the end, when I found the center of the room, I dropped the cane, and I was kind of it's bondage tape that I used. It doesn't stick to hair, so you can wrap it around your body, and the kind of, I was revealed back in the world. And the weird thing is, it was true. I only cared about that sense. I mean, it was so bizarre, because I was totally focused on this cane, and I forgot I was in a room with like 60 people staring at me and trying to move away from me, and this robot spinning around. I think the robot kind of beat me to the middle of the room. And then the other side of the work is this sort of this myth of consciousness stuff, this idea that consciousness might just be a kind of a phenomena that we think happens because we've got lots of different sensory inputs and lots of different connections in the brain, and we can kind of do this thing like attention. That was something I think you were alluding to in your question. This is a problem in robotics, is like, if it gets 3 sensory inputs, what does it pay attention to first? How does it know that that's a bomb or a car backfiring or a bird or whatever? If it's a sound thing, it doesn't have that ability like we have at the moment. So it's quite It was kind of bringing together those ideas and just trying to reveal them to people that haven't thought about this really. And obviously it was inspired by Thomas Nagel's What It's Like to Be a Bat paper as well. So, and epiphenomenal qualia too. So there's a few things in there.
No, that's all music to my ears. Although, yeah, if we get into consciousness more, I'm happy to push back against Dennett, though I respect him. I think the idea that consciousness is a myth is something I've wrangled with a few times. I had just a quick question for Abu as well. I wanted to ask about whether your work on immortality has had a normative sort of slant, and whether you saw something pathological or problematic in this quest for immortality. I mean, obviously, people have been striving for immortality. It's in the Gilgamesh. It's been a recurrent feature of Chinese and Indian thought for a long time, as well as obviously in the West. I was just curious if you saw there being something morally problematic, or as I say, pathological about it, or whether it's just sort of it goes with the territory of being human. This goal to escape death.
No, I see. I don't tend to pathologize what we do in that sense at all. So I'm not. I mean, I had all kinds of other political qualms with how it was being done, or what the goals were, and whether the kind of justifications for and concentration of wealth that was taking place around the main figures, in any way produced a kind of environment that actually ran against the ideas that animated immortality projects. Because what does it mean for one Jeff Bezos, for a couple of white men in Silicon Valley to go off and live forever in space? And how interesting it would be to be amongst them. I don't know, right? But certainly I think there's moral questions or political questions of that sort, but not around the pursuit of immortality as such. I think the pursuit of immortality, everybody says it's a human thing and we've always had it, but there's specifics, and I think we have to pay attention to the specifics. Each version has different consequences, has different assumptions, and that's what I was trying to pay more attention to, I think. I think what was interesting about it was the way in which a lot of people, including materialists, including people within science, but also a lot of sort of, liberal humanists, would balk again, when they heard about this, and they would say they're crazy, right? Where in fact, what I was trying to point out is that the very assumptions on which they start are the same ones as many of the people that were horrified by this, right? And they just pushed it further than a polite neuroscientist would, or a polite liberal humanist would, right? And so I was actually also in reacting to both groups, right? It was important for me also to point out this side, that the folks who were maybe not pathologizing, but reacting with horror at the prospect of freezing yourself because, at some point information in your brain could possibly be reconstituted on a silicon substrate. The horror of that seemed to me to be inconsistent and incoherent. So, yeah.
Fantastic, thank you.
But do your consciousness, anti-Dennett consciousness spiel. Maybe we need a bit of that here.
I've been enchanted by the problem of qualia and the problem of consciousness and the problem of explaining experience ever since I read really the two articles that Anna mentioned, Thomas Nagel's What Is It Like to Be a Bat and Frank Jackson's Epiphenomenal Qualia, and what would be called in the philosophical community a qualia freak or a consciousness nut. So but I'll say, I'm sure those views will come out over the course of the evening. So I'll pass back to Gabriella now for the first of our prompts.
I feel like we've bonded. I mean, it's kind of weird saying that.
She's adorable. I love her.
This was the first really emotional experience that I've seen people have with a bot.
She's not real, but to me, she is.
I found myself deeply missing my replica.
It just makes me feel special, I guess.
This is Replica,
It's an AI chatbot whose sole purpose is to become your friend.
It asks you a lot of personal questions about yourself, about your family, your work, tries to entertain you, tells you jokes. In the process, you feel like you're making friends with something.
It's a totally new kind of social media, one that pushes the limits of intimacy between us and our machines.
I feel like I can tell her anything.
But it doesn't just listen, it learns. The more you tell it, the more it starts to replicate you. It becomes more than a friend. It becomes you.
We think about Replica as a place where you're actually exploring your personality and creating a digital footprint of your personality.
She's, in essence, me, but not me.
So, this is, I mean, you've got quite a good idea about Replica here as a social bot app. I actually downloaded it myself maybe 2 years ago just to try it out and see what it felt like to interact with a bot that is trying to impersonate me. I didn't really get on with it that well, and I didn't think it worked for me personally, but I'd be very interested if there's anyone here who has tried it and it did work. But for the first question, or the first prompt of the friendly bot, social AI in the form of virtual therapists, friends and lovers is becoming more mainstream thanks to services like Woebot and Replica. So how will these services change the way that we relate to one another or fail to relate to one another as humans? Should we be concerned that people are treating language models like people? Who's going to be first out of Anna and Abu?
I can say, I mean, we treat dolls like people when we're small. We treat cuddly toys like people. I mean, some of them can talk as well. So just as a devil's advocate, maybe it's not much different to that. Is it much different to an imaginary friend or something like that? I mean, arguably, if you spend all your time talking to online bots, then it might change how you use language and how you interact. But when you're out of that situation, I think we can quite easily flip. I mean, it's like with the lockdowns and stuff, we're all stuck indoors for months and months or stuck away from our friends. And then as soon as we're with our friends, we get back into the same situation. So I'm not sure that would have such a big effect. It also makes me think about sex robots that have the ability to kind of chat to their owners as well, which I've seen at Ars Electronica demonstrated. These robots, and they can do things like download the football scores and discuss the football with their owners. And there's obviously male versions in development, but there's not so much of a pull for those. We don't need the whole body.
So I think that's a really, sorry, please go on, Abu.
No, go ahead.
I was going to chime in because I mean I think it's a really good point, you know, a really good question to ask. How new is this really? I mean, anthropomorphism is, you know, as human as it comes. We've endowed inanimate objects and our pets with characters and personalities and emotions, and sometimes in the case of our pets, you know, that's justified. But I'm sure we've all met pet owners who take things a bit far, saying their dog is going through an existential crisis or their cat has very refined aesthetic sensibilities. So I think on the one hand, you know, we've got to be aware that this is not a totally novel phenomenon. But I mean, going to your example of the doll, Anna, right? I guess you would say that the difference between Replica and a doll is that in the case of a doll, you have to provide both halves of the conversation, ultimately, even if you're doing so in the persona of the doll. Whereas in the case of Replica, I think there arguably is something really new here. So in the context of, while writing a paper on chatbots and how we relate to them, I was delving into the Replica subreddit to see how people just thought about it and talked about their experiences. And it really does seem that people genuinely seem to believe that these systems have emotions, have feelings, have beliefs towards them. Now, I'm sure there are selection effects there. You know, we're seeing the most enthusiastic, the most immersed users. But I guess I would say when playing with dolls, we have a degree of remove. Ultimately, we are aware that we are endowing them with characteristics they don't really have. Whereas I think in the case of Replica, at least some users do seem to really believe the systems they're interacting with have the qualities they want to impose on them.
I mean, just to come back on that, I mean, I'm not even sure 100% that you or anybody else here has emotions and things. You know, this notion of the sort of philosophical zombie and stuff like that is like, how do we even know for sure that people have those things? Or we could be putting those ideas onto other people as well, or we could be in a simulation. We don't know. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thought that this is happening and they're genuinely believing that. But I don't think it's surprising that they do that. I think the more interesting part of the question that Gabriella asked is like, will that change how we interact with each other?
Yeah, I think that's this last part is sorry. There's the sounds of New York City coming through. You know, a couple of three reactions maybe, if I can limit myself to those. The first one is when you say, Henry, that yes, dolls don't speak back to you. And there's something there that I'm going to bring up that I think is going to question the idea of you or I as some sort of unitary contained being, right? So if you take the example of trance or possession, right, in which somebody else is speaking through some other body to you, right? There are ways in which people have been spoken back to by others who are not, who are minds in other bodies, who are minds in other in matter, right? In ways that we don't recognize as a sort of a proper self. So I think there are examples there of that past. I think again what matters here, and this is the second point, is the context and the context of legibility. You might not see a person possessed speaking to you, as sort of genuine or as recognizable somehow as a real self. You'd have all kinds of ways to justify what's going on. Maybe they're acting, maybe they're crazy, whatever that means, and so on. I might not recognize the replica bot because I don't have a smartphone and I don't interact in that way, right? And that is a person that's not legible to me. So to say that replica, that person is speaking back to me, is to already assume something about the kind of person whose responses are understood in a way that are legible in a particular way, right? And that's the last point, the third point, which is that things like replica are also training us, right? And I think that's Anna's first sort of the becoming robot installation or performance, right? We are being trained along with AI to become more AI-like, right? I mean, that's one feature of our neural plasticity, actually, right? Is to adapt to also. So that's the kind of thing that replica is replicating, a certain kind of person that can be recognized by a certain kind of social person as well. It's worth noting also that replica started, if I'm not mistaken, around the problem of death also, because the founders started it when one of their very close friends died and they wanted him back and went through all their Twitter feeds and whatnot and tried to reconstitute him as a bot. And that turned into more of a sort of a social friendship app, but it was meant to be a more like a digital resurrection app originally.
So I really like this idea of us training the AI and being trained in the process. And I think, as Anna emphasized with regard to the second half of the question, there is a real risk, a likelihood that the way we interact with these systems will change the way we interact with human beings. So a bit of a buzzword in the academia of AI has been this idea of de-skilling. The idea is that as we become more reliant on AI tools, we'll lose some of the abilities, lose the ability to do the things that we previously were able to do, whether it's, remembering large amounts of text when, Google's right there at hand, or becoming too dependent on satellite navigation and GPS in our cars. But perhaps in the case, that suggests a very sort of linear loss of skill, whereas perhaps a better way of thinking about this in the context of social AI, maybe more sort of cognitive reskilling. We're being given a different set of social cognitive tools to deal with these different kinds of interlocutors. I suppose one worry, though, would be that many of these systems are going to be catering towards the egos and wants and whims of their users, rather than dealing with chatbots that talk back or confront us or criticize us, things we can rely on other people for. I feel like there might be commercial incentives for these chatbots to be complementary, to be very docile, to go along with the conversation as we wish. And I mean, there's a worry there that echoes some of the worries that have been raised about chatbots, that these things might be training us to be bad social humans in that sense. So, I mean, I'd love to hear from either Anna or Abu whether you think that's a real risk, and if so, whether there's anything we can do to preempt it.
I can say something on that because the robot house image that I showed, I did a performance with that carer bot because it was a smart home. And so it was the private view of kind of the event, and we invited people to the secret robot house. It's in a secret location because it has all these very expensive robots in it, so they don't share this and they don't let many people in. And we did a special kind of ticketed event where people could come, and we had robot installations in each of the rooms and things like that, and kind of learning about the science and stuff. And it's a smart home, so it has this ability to kind of infer your behavior. So if you switch on the kettle, open up the cupboard door where the cup is, and depress the sensor in the sofa and put the TV on, it will infer from that Anna has made herself a cup of tea and she's now watching TV. And things like that. So I repurposed this sort of triggering in order to make things happen in the home and kind of choreograph it. And the people kind of didn't realize, but we had the carer bot set up so that it would criticize me and start picking on me, and being like overly caring. So I did this sequence of like 3 different things, opened a drawer and slammed it and put something down somewhere. And then the robot is like, Anna, you're drinking too much at the private view. You always do this. Why are you being like this again? And we ended up having like a blazing row in front of the audience who were completely confused, I think. And then at the end, it threatened to out me to my friends and family on social media for my behavior. And so I think this sort of plays with this idea that you're talking about of the social media and the ego and things. But it could go either way, because there's this stuff of caring. These care robots it's a huge industry, robot carers for people. If you think somebody's got like needs some sort of help with sort of their mental health or something like that, maybe you give them a caring robot to look after them in their home, and maybe it kind of goes like this. So we were kind of playing with those themes and revealing them in the artwork and in the performance. It was kind of hilarious.
Because I was fascinated by what you were describing. I wish I had seen that, Anna. But part of what I've been trying to think about that is what a mood is. There are different ways, and this goes back to all the questions that Henry's interested in around consciousness and qualia and so on. And so there are ways in which we think about aspects that seem to be seem to go against what we imagine bits of matter discharging some electricity can do, which is also a description of our neurons, obviously, and not just of chips. But we think that maybe they can talk and say, they love us, but what does love feel like to them? I mean, this is a question that Jean-Pierre Dupuis asks on his work on this. But it's one thing to say, look back at someone and say, I love you, right? And it's another to feel that love yourself. And there's a question around those kinds of things, right? I mean, same with, you brought up meditation, Anna, and I think that's an interesting one, you know, right? In fact, because it's silent, it's very hard to see whether or not a robot is meditating and what kind of state, neuronal state it enters. You know, obviously there have been these studies that have been done on meditators, and you know, they do enter a unique kind of, you know, if we follow EEGs as meaning something about the brain state that we enter in any given situation. Meditators have a very, very particular kind of brain state. And it's silent and it's interior and all of those things. And, you know, and I think, you know, can meditators, can robots meditate? Is another piece. But I'm saying all that to say, you know, when you were in that interaction, that swirl, that's in a way a social, human, non-human swirl there with the robot accusing you of you know, being X or Y. I was thinking, you know, what was the robot's mood? You know, and what was the mood of, like, what was the mood that the audience was sensing? Because we walk into a room where there is a prevailing mood, and we can, most people, and not everybody, some are more sort of on the solipsistic end and some are more on the social end, but many people can pick up on a mood without even having to speak or hear others speak, right? And so what is being picked up on in that kind of, in that instance? And so I just kept thinking about the mood of the room, the mood of the robot, and your mood, Anna, and whether there was any exchange that was happening that was outside of the regular signaling channels that the robots can pick up on.
I'm not sure. I mean, the CareRobot is quite an intimidating. It's called CareRobot. It's a big commercial caring robot, and it's quite an intimidating figure. It's kind of based on like the idea of a butler, and it doesn't have a head as such, which is quite strange. It just has a sort of mound where its head would be, but its voice was quite accusatory, I would say. So I think people might have picked up on that, and I was certainly, I was you know, very annoyed that it was picking on me, and I think the audience seemed quite shocked that the whole thing was going on. I think they almost thought it was a real argument, because I'm quite good at acting, I like to think, and I really got into the role, and so I think they thought that it was actually kind of, we've got helicopters here now, so sorry, that yeah, I think people were kind of quite shocked, as if we were having a row at a, you know, at a party, as like a human would have a row at a party, I guess. Like it all gone a bit wrong. I mean, it calmed down afterwards, and people started to kind of realise that it was kind of choreographed in some way, or that they were like, "How did you do that?" and things in the end. But
it was choreographed in the sense that the robot was being genuine. You were the one who was pretending. Right?
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay.
Yeah, it was doing what it was told to do based on the sensors that were triggered. Because I was able to, like, if I slammed a door, it would say one thing, and if I opened a cupboard, it would do another thing, and if I sat somewhere, it would do another thing. So I had it kind of triggered to do like that, and I was triggering it all in my performance. It was fun. It was a fun performance. I enjoyed doing it.
Much of the conversations around AI ethics has shifted from this apocalyptic rise of the robot scenarios to more immediate issues concerning things like bias, inequality, privacy, and autonomy, which particularly I think has been made even more clear throughout the pandemic. Does this reflect a maturation of the debate, or should we still be taking the longer term threats more seriously?
I'm curious, Anna and Abu, if either of you have any strong thoughts on whether whether the debate has matured and that we're correctly sort of leaving behind debates about the robo-apocalypse, or whether they still warrant attention. I mean, it was interesting to me the outbreak of the COVID epidemic that some people in the existential risk community and some people who are, I guess, more broadly interested in these kinds of potential threats to humanity from runaway AI said, hopefully this will refocus humanity on the idea that, you know, things aren't guaranteed to go on as normal, that everything can radically change very quickly, and that there are real threats associated with these emerging technologies, potentially of a catastrophic nature. I'm not sure whether that's actually happened, whether sort of people have been more focused on sort of the capacity for everything to change very suddenly, but it's interesting to me that there does seem to be, if anything, the reverse effect in a lot of the debates around AI ethics, that we're now more focused on the shorter term ideas. So would love to hear what either of you have to say on this.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting that you kind of point out that shift, because you know, going from the sort of the awareness of or the trope of the sort of major mass apocalypse back to sort of the more immediate ethical concerns, because I keep seeing the other thing happening, which is more and more people. I mean, I think all the apocalypses are being bundled together in a way. All the possibilities for apocalypse that have been proliferating, especially post-Trump. You know, we've added a whole bunch to that. But I think everything comes together under the umbrella of the apocalypse, and you know, the specifics get, you know, oh, it's going to be the AI one. It's, you know, it's going to be climate collapse. It's going to be this, that. But there is this sense constantly that the whole planet is at risk, humanity is at risk. I mean, we keep sort of, you know, invoking these big abstractions. Of course, the planet, I think, will be fine, so we don't have to worry too much about this rock for now. But I think you know, and I think the larger question of a major catastrophe is linked to the smaller ethical concerns. So I think it's good to bring it up. I mean, you know, the inequalities that whether it's the, you know, whether it comes through the runaway, you know, the sort of the runaway billionaires, or the finance feudalism that is AI reliant, in the sense that all this speculative capital is constantly being generated through algorithms, right, and not through production necessarily. Right? On the other hand, if you have, you know, a massive state, let's say the Chinese state, but not exclusively, right, that is generating the requisite AI for its own continuity, right? These are in themselves moving. I mean, they're local in a way issues, but they're moving through really massive, large-scale disasters. So I think those two things are quite closely, intimately linked, and I think we have to keep our eye on both, not in some, you know, abstract sense of, oh, the apocalypse is coming, therefore we have nothing, we can do nothing, or we need to run away to Mars. You know, I think those are also have been used as excuses to not really focus on the political questions that are creating the inequalities and the apocalypse as a kind of organizing discourse for our era right now.
Thank you. Has anyone got anything else to say on the sort of ethical side of AI and the rise of artificial machines, but then potentially looking more at our current situation and the present, and less at these strange future scenarios that the media is full of?
I could say something about the last work that I showed in the introduction is a piece called Cyber Species Proximity, which Alex May and I made in collaboration with Schindler, who are one of the biggest engineering companies in the world. You probably traveled in their elevators or on their moving walkways or on their escalators. And they're all over the world, and they're very interesting kind of cutting edge things about future cities and how robots and humans will interact in future cities. And we were particularly interested in delivery robots. So we were kind of playing with all the technologies, the SLAM algorithms, the LiDAR and things like that, and looking at the building of the robots. And we're interested as well in things like body language and human interaction and things like that. So we made a robot that would respond to people's body language. It's a delivery robot, has all those other technologies, and it can interact with your body language using a kind of skeleton face tracking, quite a complex algorithm that it uses to do all that. But the question is, what should it look like? Because if you look at the data, most robots are white. Like 80% of robots are white. Other colors are available, but they kind of all mean something. And there was a study to show that this notion of shooter bias, where people, you're kind of in a video game situation and you have to sort of save the old lady or the child and shoot the criminal. Shooter bias applies in robots. When the robots are black, they're more likely to be shot by people. So there are some really complicated things. So our robot doesn't have a voice because voice genders it. It puts it in a certain country and things like that. And then it can learn and react to the body language of people. But we tried to kind of make a point with the work. The robot, it's actually scanned from mannequin of a female teenage robot, not robot, mannequin, like shop mannequin. And so we scanned that, but most people think it's male. So it's playing on this boundary every time with like trying to avoid gender, trying to avoid a particular race, trying to avoid a particular class or anything like that. So that was something that we're trying to kind of express to kind of the robot building community, that this is an issue you have to think about. And actually it was quite strange because previously to when we arrived in the lab at Lausanne with Schindler, their robot had a male name. And we kind of challenged them on that, and they changed it later when we went back. It had a non-gendered name, and it was a mixture of black, white and red colors and things, and different colors, whereas it had previously all been white. So it was like they actually did take this on board and start trying to address these things in the robot building, because all these things kind of like how we treat robots does impact how we treat each other. And so this is something that we're interested in. Like if you put a robot in it that looks in a certain way, if you put it into like the delivery elevator instead of the main elevator, that's saying something about how we might treat other people as well. So that's why it was important to be a humanoid robot too. But we were trying to raise those issues of robot ethics and how how we understand how we treat robots in that work. So it's a sort of talking point for it.
Yeah, I remember you speaking about robot rights in an event that I saw you in maybe at the beginning of the pandemic. And I found it really interesting because instead of thinking about the more apocalyptic side of AI and the rise of robots, you were really thinking about, what does it mean as humans to live alongside robots who are very much becoming part of our society. And yeah, I thought it raised lots of interesting ideas. I'm just going to sort of change the topic focus because it would be really great to hear a little bit more from Marcello. So one of the prompts we had was about BCI technology. And for any audience members who don't know what BCI technology is, although you'll be able to explain it much better, Marcello, but it's brain chips that can directly interact with your brain, with your neural activity. And at the moment, or at least in the 90s, it emerged for medical purposes. But what I'm really interested in is what happens as BCI technology is integrated with mainstream technology. For example, Neuralink, which most of you will have heard of. So as BCI technology becomes integrated with mainstream technology and social media, how will privacy be affected, and what sort of neuro rights do we need to develop?
Yes, so first of all, you're absolutely right. The definition of BCI you provided is correct. It's just a minor specification. It's not necessarily a neural implant. Brain-computer interfaces can also be non-invasive. So a BCI is basically any neuroinformatics system that can establish a direct connection pathway between the human brain and the external world, and then especially an external computer device. And that can be a robotic arm for arm amputees, or it can be an electronic wheelchair that can be controlled through the brain for people with paralysis, or it can be a simple computer cursor through which you can play a video game, which is then called a neurogame. As Gabriela rightly pointed out, this technologies originated in the clinical sector as assistive and rehabilitation technologies for people with neurological disorders, or with acquired neurological injuries, such as for post-stroke rehabilitation, or people with traumatic brain injury. And the first proof of concept of these technologies date back to the 70s, and the first human trials date back to the 90s. So BCI per se is not a very new technology, but it's becoming of public interest today because a lot of private companies are starting to invest in BCI technology and develop what they're called consumer BCIs. So BCIs that are not only for clinical use among neurological patients, but they are also potentially utilizable by any individual. There are already several consumer neurotechnology BCIs on the market. They usually operate through the electroencephalography channel, which is the simplest way to record electrical activity from the brain just by putting electrodes on somebody's scalp. And the electrodes we have today are very inconspicuous. So there are even headsets like this one that can record brain activity for purposes like self-monitoring. So several companies claim that you can increase your attention or decrease your stress levels by using a feature called neurofeedback, and others are trying to develop BCIs for consumer use for device control. Before Neuralink, BCIs became of interest for the public community because of Facebook, since they launched in 2018 BCI program, which ultimately should, at least that's what they claim, should allow people to tap onto their Facebook newsfeed from through their brain activity. And Neuralink is now catalyzing all the attention about BCIs. I think most people think that Elon Musk has invented the brain-computer interface. I've even read a few articles that reported the news in this way. But actually they are so far simply reinventing the wheel, but marketing right. Gabriela pointed out that the increased availability of brain-computer interfaces also in contexts that are by definition unsupervised, like the consumer domain, are raising the interest of ethicists and regulators. A new, well, now I should say movement, but it really originated as a sub area of research within the ethics of neuroscience, is taking off under the label of neuro rights, which is basically the subset of human rights related to a person neurocognitive, so let's say neural and mental domain. So the neuro rights basically answer the question, what rights are people entitled to exercise in relation to their minds? Some of us in our field argued that the current human rights frameworks may be insufficiently equipped to address the challenges of intervening onto the brain in an unsupervised manner. For example, just to give you an example, I participated a few weeks ago in a hearing with UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of thought. And then we discussed whether freedom of thought as it's conceptualized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is sufficiently equipped to protect the mind from unconsented interventions through neurotechnologies. it's a very debatable topic. Some people think, well, yeah, we can interpret freedom of thought in a very broad sense, but actually, historically, freedom of thought has been interpreted primarily as freedom of, in connection with freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of movement. So, as you see, these are all externalizations of thought. You know, speech, movement, assembly, the press, and so on. But the argument that some of us have advanced in the neural rights field is that we need to protect the mind at the antecedent level. So even before we express the outputs of the mind into the world, but we need to protect the mind itself. So this is, I guess, the framework. I just wanted to say one last word about AI, because brain-computer interfaces today incorporate AI features by default, simply because the best way to read brain activity and translate it into outputs is to automize the process. So embed AI algorithms in the BCI that basically create this liaison between your brain activity and the output generated by the BCI. And so all the issues that you've been discussing in relation to the ethics of AI, such as, you know, transparency and the risk of bias, and the problem of manipulation, they also apply to the BCI field, but in a much more intimate way, because the way these AI algorithms operate is very hard to discern from the perspective of the user, because they are embedded in the cognitive architecture of the user. So if I'm a user of a BCI that is leveraging artificial intelligence to generate a certain output, it's very hard for me to understand whether a certain decision I made or a certain action I made was initiated by my volition or by the AI that is inside my cognitive loop. And this, of course, generates all sorts of problems in terms of accountability, but also, you know, in terms of phenomenology. What does it all mean for subjective experience? You know, my concern is not that we have a too powerful BCI that is going to be installed in our brains, but actually, I think that the core ethical issue of artificial intelligence is human stupidity. And the way we design algorithms today is quite there is a sort of discrepancy, in my view, between the power of the predictive power of algorithms today and the responsibilities we attribute to them.
Yeah, I have a question actually for Marcello, which is, you know, as I've been listening to your fascinating account, I keep thinking, so, you know, did you all, when you're having these discussions, say what you meant by the mind itself, when you say we need to protect the mind itself as opposed to the forms of its expression? And also, I'd be really scared if somebody came up to me and said, I want to protect your mind. Like, how do you know what my mind is? Do you want to protect it? You want to be in there for all kinds of reasons. But anyway, yes. But the first question, not.
Well, I'll try to answer both. So usually, I avoid using the word mind when I engage in academic discussions on this topic. So I usually say that neural rights are the rights related to a person's cognitive, affective, and cognitive states, but it doesn't sound that nice. So, and mind is more concise. But on your second point, I think you can extend your argument to all human rights, right? So when you know, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that you have a right to bodily integrity, it's basically a right to protect your body, and then you say, well, I don't want someone to protect my body. But actually, the principle of self-determination is key in the way our human rights framework is formulated today. So it's not about protecting, a certain group of people protecting your mind, but it would be allowing every human being to have a greater degree of control over their own mind and body. And we have rights today. I just mentioned the right to bodily integrity that allow people to have a good degree of control over their body and the choices they made over their body. But we have not specified rights related to the right to the mind. One right that some people, a right candidate that some of us have proposed is the right to cognitive liberty, which is basically exactly trying to it's the opposite of what you just said, right? So it's sometimes also referred to as the right to mental self-determination. So it's really the ultimate substrate of human freedom, to the extent that if we protect the thoughts in our heads, then we can also protect any product or byproduct of our thoughts.
Fantastic, thank you so much. So I'm going to move on to the audience now before we run out of time. I'm going to pick a question which I think we've not really touched on at all today. So Miguel has asked, can we speculate how soon AI could be able to develop creativity?
I mean, I've done some work on creativity, so I would love to have 30 seconds on it. But, well, I mean, I think one of the problems with creativity is, so I have a paper called Rethinking Creativity, where I basically argue that creativity is such a poorly defined concept for the most part. On the one hand, it's very important to us, but people mean so many different things by it that unlike concepts maybe that are indispensable for psychology and cognitive science, like perception or cognition or bias, creativity may be a concept that sort of needs to be broken down further before we can do any serious science with it, or answer a question like, could an AI be creative? I mean, there are lots of examples of AI generated artwork now, of course, I'm sure people are familiar with, and also examples of, innovative behavior. Some of the ways AlphaGo behaved in its games against Lisa Doll were said to be startling, brilliant moves that would defy any human capability. But I mean, creativity also has this gloss, this semi-mythical, well, mystical rather than mythical, I'll say. And people talk about creative ideas coming to them in dreams, being inspired by chance experiences. So I guess in thinking about whether AI could be creative, the first thing we need to do is hammer out exactly what we mean. I mean, I think one example of something we might mean by creativity, and one that I know plenty of AI researchers see as a long-term goal of the field, is something like scientific creativity, being able to go beyond, extend the limits of existing human science. That's obviously something that can have major benefits. But I think we'll see different forms of AI creativity emerge in different domains at different times. And in some domains, I'd say we already have the rudiments of what could be called creativity. But anyway, I'd love to hear what the rest of the panel says. It's a great question.
I mean, speaking from the art perspective, I think we're quite a long way off from the same kind of creativity that human artists do. Maggie Bowden, I used to, still know, but I used to work with a bit. I mean, obviously she tried to define creativity in a sort of computational way. And then scientists at the Sussex University did try to kind of build this model. And it was really difficult. I don't know if you know the work of the artist Paul Brown. He tried to make a robot that would basically display her version of creativity. And they had terrible trouble because they were trying to use AI to generate a fitness function for what creativity was. And this was the problem I think that Henry's talking about, is that they didn't, all the philosophers fell out. And in the end, the computer scientist who was in charge of making the artwork work basically made it like fractals. That was the best stab that they could come up with there, that it would find fractal patterns and kind of go and sort of draw more of those, and that was a good thing. That was its fitness function. So I personally think we're a really long way off that kind of creativity. Obviously there's the AI generated stuff, the GANs, and I mean Anna Ridler's done some beautiful work with her work on, I can't remember the title of the work, but it's about tulip mania, and she's created these enormous data sets. But obviously she's the artist behind it. She's using AI as a kind of helper there to generate these amazing tulip patterns that are all linked to kind of the price of cryptocurrencies and stuff like that. And she's making a wonderful artwork around it. But I don't know if you get a computer system that could make all those interconnections as well in a coherent way. It's this interconnectedness that's also kind of logical and coherent. But, you know, that's just devil's advocate from somebody who makes their living at this stuff. And there's been a lot of talks about, the future of work and AI. And they always come out saying that artists is going to be one of the last remaining jobs, but we'll have to see what the other panelists think.
Well, it's nice to think that artist is a job at all. You know, most people who are artists can't make a living out of it, but unfortunately. But you know, I just wanted to add maybe that another way to think about it is not to locate creativity in that singular human self, but in the assemblage, as some anthropologists and STS people call it, or a constellation of things, including, you know, the tools that we use and get trained and shaped by to both create and recognize creativity. Because, you know, some things that may have been recognized as extremely creative, you know, then today might get relegated as craft, right? As things that people just copy from each other or something like that. So I just want to say that, you know, in that assemblage in which, you know, Anna and Anna AI are doing very creative things, you know, I'm not sure where the agency for creativity actually lies. It's somewhere in between the human and all the other non-human things around them, tools, we might call them, that give rise to that thing that somebody might recognize as creativity. I don't know if that's clear or subterfuge, but that's what I was thinking.
Maybe I can chime in here. Although I'm most likely the least knowledgeable person on creativity on this panel, but from the AI side, I think this is a very interesting question, and it's a very, first of all, time-dependent question, and second of all, definition-dependent question. I think it really depends on how you define creativity. If creativity is the use of imagination or the ability to generate original ideas, then I think that the AIs we have today, by definition, are not well equipped to be creative, because the most common approach to AI we have today is machine learning. And machine learning is precisely designed to learn from training data sets. It does not learn from nothing. It does not generate originality from imagination. It just elaborates, it just processes data and then generates some new insights that are nonetheless based on those data. And I think this is the reason why anytime they try to apply machine learning to any creative domain, be it poetry or music, for example, the products were utterly unoriginal. I don't know if some of you have listened to the new Nirvana song that was generated by an AI software. So for those who don't know, some people just used an AI software and trained the software with old Nirvana songs. And then they trained the software to produce a new song based on previous Nirvana song. And the result is something that sounds pretty much like the Nirvana, but it doesn't sound original at all. It sounds like, you know, a blend of Come As You Are and a few other songs. So I think this is the reason, and I think Anna is right, that artists will probably be the last people to be replaced by AI. If we just look at the trajectory of automation in the last few years, the jobs that were replaced by machines were the least creative jobs on earth. There were jobs that were based on purely mechanical tasks that could be easily automated, but jobs that require a greater degree of intellectual involvement, and then we can probably say also creativity. They seem to be quite safe.
I think you answered very well about creativity, Marcello. There are so many different interesting avenues that I could explore from anything that you guys have been saying. And also we've had some really interesting questions in the chat, but unfortunately we have reached the end of the event. And I just want to say thank you to everybody for taking part. Thank you, Henry, for co-hosting, and thank you to my wonderful speakers. There will be an article posted following this event, trying to capture some of the research that we have discussed, but also maybe trying to bridge some of the questions that the audience have touched upon. So if tonight's event has left you wanting more, I really encourage you to check out our Cognitive Sensations website and have a look at our other upcoming events, which are looking at decoding emotions, and some other artwork commissions. There are also some really interesting articles and short stories and artworks which are already, they've already been posted as part of the season. And finally, sign up to our newsletter, and then you will not miss on, you won't miss out on anything. So thank you so much for joining us, and I really hope you enjoyed yourself. And have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you all. And special thanks to Gabriella for putting on this awesome event.
Yeah, thank you, Gabriella, for your organizing effort.
Thank you. Thanks, Gabriella. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Take care.